everybody, welcome back. Dr. Bianchi here, and today we are going to be zooming in and looking more at neurons, the basic building blocks of our nervous system. So just to provide some context and some history, a famous figure in the field of neuroscience was Raymond Cajal, and he's known for establishing what's known as the neuron doctrine. And he argued that the brain is made up of many small discrete cells. Okay, in this case, we're talking about neurons, of course. So his famous research and work really allowed us to come to that conclusion that our brain consists of these many small but discrete cells. He's known for some of his famous artwork. He did extensive drawings of how he thought neurons looked in the brain. And you can hop on Google or on the internet and see a whole assortment of Cajal's famous drawings. But he's a pioneer in the history of neuroscience, and he really was the one to figure out that neurons make up the brain and that they are a huge part in what's giving rise to our cognition and behavior. So there's almost 100 billion neurons in the brain. That's the typical estimate, and they make a massive amount of connections with other cells. These neurons are like other cells in the body. They have a membrane, they have a nucleus, and they have specialized organelles. So here's just a typical neuron down here. What we're going to do now is we're going to zoom in and spend some time looking at the different components of the neuron, because understanding the anatomy of the neuron is going to be critical for the next topic that we'll cover, talking about how neurons communicate with one another or how they send messages. So let's go ahead and start with the anatomy. Okay, here's a close-up view of a neuron. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the different structures of the neuron. I'm going to go ahead and spend a little bit of time walking through key anatomical parts of the typical neuron and giving you a general idea as to what the function of that area is. So up here we have our typical neuron. Now here's our cell body or soma, and what you'll see are these long branch-like structures reaching out into space. Okay, these are known as the dendrites. Okay, they're branches that are reaching out, and they pick up incoming messages from other cells. They basically receive information. Okay, here's our cell body with a nucleus, of course, just like every cell. And here we have our axon hillock. Now, what you'll see later on is that neurons basically communicate in two ways. They do so electrically and chemically. At the axon hillock, if this cell is stimulated enough by an incoming message, an electrical signal will be generated. Okay, and that electrical signal will be sent all the way down this long tube-like structure, which is known as the axon. Okay, it's basically a tunnel for that electrical message to be sent through. Now, this axon is insulated by what's called the myelin sheath. That's just a fancy term for insulation surrounding the axon, and it allows the message to proceed more quickly. The electrical signal will jump node to node, hence the term here, the nodes of Ranvier, little gaps in the insulation. And if you were to watch a neuron fire in live time, the message would be sent so fast that it would appear to jump node to node all the way down to the end of the axon. Now here we are at the end of the axon, and this region is known as the area of axon terminals. Okay, and down here is where we see the electrical communication now transfer into a process of chemical communication. So down at the end of the axon, we see these terminal branches. Okay, and these are the terminal boutons. Okay, packed within these boutons are neurotransmitters. You may have heard of that term. These are chemicals that are involved in our brain, in our psychological functioning. At the end of the axon, we'll see the release of neurotransmitters that will go on to affect another cell. Okay, but for now, this is just sort of an overview of the different parts of the neuron that permit electrical and chemical communication across cells. Now I'm going to be uploading another video that goes in full depth into how that electrical and communication is happening, but this is just sort of the basics. Here we're zooming in and we're just seeing the neuron cell body. Here are the dendrites reaching out into space, picking up messages coming from other cells. Okay, here's another image of a neuron. And I think when you're first sort of learning the anatomy and getting used to the different parts and structures of the neuron, it helps to see different images. Okay, again, our typical neuron with a cell body, an axon terminal. Here are our dendritic branches reaching out into space. Over here on the left, you can see, zooming in, the myelin sheath that coats the axon. Again, that makes the electrical signal move much more quickly. Okay, here's yet another close-up view. In this case, here we have our neuron. We have an electrical impulse being sent down the axon. Okay, the cell has been stimulated powerfully enough, and what happens when we get to the axon terminal, right? Here's zooming in, looking at the chemical aspect of neural communication. We have the release of neurotransmitters that are docked here at the end of the neuron. They will go across what's called a synapse. Okay, that's just a gap between two neurons. Okay, and they'll go on and they'll dock and lodge onto the receptor sites of the next cell and go on to affect that cell's behavior, possibly generating another neural signal. Okay, so for now, I just want you to be familiar with the anatomy. Again, you should watch the next video in this series, which is going to provide a lot of depth about the details of electrical and chemical communication in neurons. There are different types of neurons, and they're classified by their function. Sensory neurons carry information to the brain. Okay, our senses pick up information in the environment, whether it's our eyes, our ears, our sense of taste, and that information is going to go up to the brain via sensory neurons. Motor neurons carry information from the brain to the muscles. They allow us to move and behave in the environment. Okay, they're motor commands that come down and direct behavior. Interneurons are basically middleman neurons. Okay, between the sensory and the motor neurons, they help facilitate messages and they help facilitate communication between sensory and motor cells. Okay, here are some images just showing you different types of neurons. The actual setup of the neuron can vary depending on what kind of neuron it is. Here we have a sensory neuron. Okay, here are receptor cells. Let's just say we're in the retina, okay, and we know we have rods and cones in the back of the retina that pick up on light data, okay, and that information gets sent up to the brain. Here's a motor neuron. Okay, here we have our cell body and our dendrites, our axon, and remember, motor neurons direct behavior, so here this neuron is making direct contact with a muscle, okay, to facilitate movement. And here are some images of interneurons. They can vary in shape depending on whether or not they send messages very long distance. Okay, this is a projection neuron, or more locally, this is a local neuron. Okay, various shapes for the interneurons. But you should be familiar with sensory, motor, and interneurons and understand their general functions. Okay, here's just another image. I think it's really useful just walking through this full circle process. Okay, how does the brain produce behavior? Here we have receptors in the skin. Okay, in this case, we're talking about the sense of touch. Okay, maybe I put my hand down on something, I touch something. Receptors in my skin send a sensory message. Okay, here we are coming into the spinal cord. Okay, this is a sensory neuron, also known as an afferent neuron. That terminology is interchangeable. Okay, an interneuron facilitates communication between the sensory neuron's message and the motor message. Okay, here's our motor neuron, also known as an efferent neuron. It exits the spinal cord, okay, and directs some kind of behavior. In this case, making contact with a muscle. Maybe I pick my hand off that table because I was touching something uncomfortable. So this diagram really brings together the full circle picture of how sensory data gets sent into the nervous system and how the interaction between sensory, inter, and motor neurons can produce behavior. So you should be familiar with this diagram and be able to explain it. So that's going to wrap up this mini lecture where we've been introduced to the anatomy of the neuron, the different types of neurons and their structure, and we've gotten just a little bit of an overview of how neurons communicate electrically and chemically. Again, more details about that process coming up in the next video, so be sure to watch it. And that's all for now.